Earlier this year, in 2025, the Department of Justice under former President Trump's administration moved to roll back one of the most restrictive parts of the Gun Control Act, a part that every president, both Democrat and Republican, has defended since 1968. This step is not just a technical legal change, it's something that could impact millions of Americans directly or indirectly. Whether someone owns firearms or not, the implications run wide because they reach into questions of rights, responsibilities, and how laws treat different groups of adults. For decades, the Gun Control Act of 1968 has been a pillar of federal firearms regulation. It was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson in a turbulent year for the United States, a year marked by shocking acts of violence, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy just 5 years earlier still loomed large in the national memory, and Congress was under pressure to respond decisively to fears about violent crime and political instability. Among the provisions introduced back then was a restriction aimed specifically at people between 18 and 20 years old, banning them from purchasing handguns from federally licensed firearms dealers, also known as FFLs. The thinking at the time was that this age group was more susceptible to being pulled into criminal activity, and that handguns, being easy to conceal, could contribute to violence in urban areas. It's important to remember that this restriction did not completely prohibit ownership. 18 to 20-year-olds could still legally possess handguns if they were gifted one or obtained it through a private sale, as long as their state allowed it. However, they could not walk into an FFL and buy one directly. Over the years, some states have gone even further, closing the private sale or gift loophole entirely and making it illegal for anyone under 21 to possess a handgun in any form. The majority of states, though, still follow the federal framework, meaning young adults in that age range can own a handgun through private means but not purchase one through a licensed dealer. This federal rule has been in place for over half a century, defended by administrations across the political spectrum, until the shift that occurred this year. The change stems from a recent appeals court ruling that found the 21-plus handgun purchase rule unconstitutional when compared to the precedent set in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, decided by the Supreme Court in 2022. That landmark case fundamentally altered how courts evaluate Second Amendment challenges, focusing heavily on historical tradition rather than modern policy arguments. The appeals court essentially said there's no historical basis for treating 18 to 20-year-old adults as a separate category of citizens who cannot fully exercise their right to purchase a handgun from an FFL. In response to this ruling, the DOJ announced it would no longer enforce the federal 21-plus handgun purchase law, marking a major departure from the long-standing practice of defending federal gun restrictions in court. This move has been described by legal experts as a significant moment in the evolving landscape of firearms regulation, particularly because it signals that federal authorities are willing to stand down on a regulation that had seemed untouchable for decades. Supporters of the rollback argue that the current restriction is fundamentally inconsistent. At 18, individuals in the United States can vote in federal elections, sign binding contracts, enlist in the military, and even be deployed to combat zones. They can take on significant debt, live independently, and be tried as adults in the criminal justice system. Yet when it comes to purchasing one of the most practical tools for self-defense, a handgun, they face a legal barrier. Statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and other sources show that while young adults in the 18 to 20-year-old range are overrepresented in certain crime statistics, the vast majority are law-abiding citizens. The figure often cited by gun rights advocates is that only about 1% of handguns purchased by individuals in this age group from FFLs are later linked to crimes. If that number is accurate, it raises the question of whether the restriction is doing anything meaningful to curb criminal activity, or if it's simply preventing responsible young adults from exercising a constitutional right. There's also the practical consideration of self-defense. Many young adults are in transitional stages of life, starting college, working late-night shifts, taking jobs that involve travel, or living in unfamiliar areas. In some cases, these jobs are exactly the kind that put people in higher-risk situations, such as working alone at night or handling cash. A well-known incident that comes to mind involves a fast food drive-in where young employees were robbed late at night. Two of them were under 21 and could not have legally purchased a handgun for self-protection under federal law. In that situation, and in many like it, the individuals complied and survived unharmed. but the potential for tragedy was real. Stories like this underline why some see the restriction as not only unfair, but potentially dangerous, denying people the ability to defend themselves during a period of life when they may be most vulnerable. The counterargument often centers on the fact that studies show higher rates of impulsive behavior and violent crime in the 18 to 20-year-old demographic compared to older age groups. Critics of the rollback say that this data justifies keeping the age restriction in place to prevent avoidable harm. However, opponents of the law respond by pointing out that it doesn't prevent illicit access to firearms. Those determined to break the law can still obtain guns through illegal channels. The restriction primarily affects those who are willing to comply with the law, effectively punishing the very group that is trying to do things the right way. This inconsistency is part of what has driven legal challenges over the years, culminating in the current moment where the DOJ's decision aligns with the direction of recent court rulings. As the summer of 2025 unfolds, the legal landscape is in a state of flux. Several states are watching closely, especially those with stricter gun laws, because if the Supreme Court ultimately upholds the appeals court's reasoning, it could force widespread changes at the state level. Lawsuits challenging state-level 21-plus rules are already in progress, and a favorable decision for gun rights advocates could unravel similar restrictions far beyond the original federal provision. This is why the DOJ's shift is seen as more than just a policy change. It's potentially the first domino in a chain reaction that could redefine the balance between state authority and individual rights under the Second Amendment, continuing from where everything has led so far. The real question in 2025 is whether adults aged 18 to 20 will be treated like every other adult when it comes to buying a handgun from a licensed dealer. Earlier this year, the Department of Justice stepped back from defending the long-standing 21-plus purchase rule after an appeals court. Applying the Bruin decision, concluded there was no historical tradition for blocking legal adults from such purchases. That shift isn't just a legal footnote. It marks a break from decades of federal policy and has the potential to reshape how the Second Amendment is applied to an entire age group. Supporters of change argue this is about consistency. At 18, Americans can vote in federal elections, enlist in the military, take on significant debt, be tried as adults in court, and make countless other adult decisions. Yet they face a barrier when it comes to purchasing a handgun through an FFL, even with a background check. The contradiction frustrates many, especially with data suggesting that only about 1% of handguns sold to this group by licensed dealers are later connected to crimes. If that figure holds true, the restriction burdens lawful buyers without addressing the real source of illegal firearms. Opponents point to evidence that this age range has higher rates of certain offenses and argue that the rule adds a layer of protection. But those in favor of repeal counter that the law doesn't stop illicit acquisition, straw purchasers, theft, and the black market bypass age rules entirely. The ones most affected are those who would have complied with the law, meaning the rule essentially punishes the people it claims to trust least, but who are, in fact, the most law-abiding. Real-world situations make the stakes clear. Many in this age group are in transitional years, working late shifts, traveling between jobs and school, or living in neighborhoods they don't know well. A widely reported incident at a drive-in-style fast food restaurant saw young workers robbed late at night. 2 were under 21 and could not legally buy a handgun for self-defense under federal law. They weren't harmed, but the risk was undeniable. And similar situations occur often enough to keep the debate alive. The Bruin decision in 2022 reshaped Second Amendment litigation by requiring modern gun laws to fit within the nation's historical tradition. Courts looking back to the late 1700s and early 1800s have found little precedent for blanket bans on firearm purchases by legal adults. That was the basis for the appeals court's ruling earlier this year, and the DOJ's decision not to fight it shows that the federal government is willing to follow that interpretation. If the Supreme Court takes up the issue later this year and agrees with the appeals court, states that mirror the federal rule could be forced to roll it back. Active lawsuits in those states could quickly lead to changes in eligibility, with dealers adjusting their compliance processes and young adults finally able to make lawful purchases. If the court rules the other way, states will be free to keep or tighten their laws, justifying them through whatever historical parallels they can present under the Bruin framework. Both sides frame their positions around public safety. Those advocating change push for targeted enforcement, focus on repeat offenders, prosecute straw purchasers, secure the supply chain, and promote responsible ownership through training and storage incentives. They argue that these measures cut crime without stripping rights from millions. Critics remain skeptical, believing that lowering the purchase age could add to risks, even if the increase is small, and that the current rule is a safeguard worth keeping. Fairness, however, is the core of the argument for repeal. A society that hands 18-year-olds a ballot, military orders, and legal contracts shouldn't stop them at the gun counter if they meet all other legal requirements. That doesn't mean ignoring the fact that some will act recklessly. It means holding those individuals accountable without assuming guilt from age alone. Earlier this year's DOJ decision marked a major step toward aligning the law with that principle. In the coming months of 2025, the courts may either cement that shift or reverse it. Whatever the outcome, the measure of success will be whether the policy addresses actual threats while respecting the rights of those who follow the law from the day they become adults.